It was 8 days after the funeral, and the smell of industrial-strength lilies still clung to the silk drapes of the formal dining room, a scent that now represented not sorrow, but an aggressive, suffocating greed. The house felt less like a home that had just lost its patriarch, Arthur Beaumont, and more like a high-stakes auction viewing, where everyone present was already calculating the residual value of the silverware. I remember staring at Aunt Linda during the reading of the will, trying to reconcile the image of the weeping relative I had seen just a week prior, her entire body convulsing dramatically over the polished mahogany casket, with the sharp, predatory gleam in her eyes as the lawyer, Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat. Linda had mastered the art of performative grief. She had cried louder than anyone else, which was genuinely impressive considering she had been texting her realtor about Dad's waterfront condominium before the final hymns were even sung.
That condo, incidentally, was why we were all sitting there, crammed into that overheated room, pretending to mourn a man none of us had truly appreciated, until the moment his heart finally gave out in the sterile quiet of the ICU. Dad had been an eccentric millionaire, the kind of self-made man who loved mid-century architecture, vintage single-malt scotch, and, unfortunately, trusting people who wore expensive suits but possessed the moral fortitude of wet cardboard. His estate, a sprawling collection of properties, investment portfolios, and Art Deco furniture, was estimated conservatively at around $15 million. It was a sum large enough to make distant cousins crawl out of the woodwork like termites summoned by the smell of fresh cash, and small enough that everyone felt personally entitled to the entirety of it. This specific quantum of wealth seemed to be the perfect trigger for familial psychosis. I, his only biological child, had always been the quiet, expected heir. My relationship with Dad was complicated, perhaps overly functional. We weren't saccharine, but we were fundamentally solid. I managed his foundation, respected his privacy, and generally stayed out of the way of his more questionable business decisions, the kind of behavior that usually warrants the lion's share of the legacy. I had expected the customary distribution, the main house to me, the bulk of the trust funds, and perhaps some minor bequests to the extended family, including a reasonable slice for my half-brother, Richard, who hadn't spoken to Dad consistently since 2018, when he'd been cut off after one too many failed crypto ventures. Richard. Even thinking his name brings a certain bitter, metallic taste to my mouth, like licking a 9-volt battery. Richard wasn't just selfish. He was meticulously, performatively cheap, yet demanded luxury.
He was the kind of person who would successfully steal $2 million, but would refuse to pay for Spotify Premium, insisting on listening to the free tier with the aggressive advertising interspersed throughout his daily routine of justifying poor life choices. He was 2 years my senior, but emotionally, he was permanently stuck in the aggressive bargaining phase of a 3-year-old demanding a specific brightly colored toy. He dressed impeccably now, a sharp, custom-tailored suit that looked suspiciously new, as if purchased specifically for the reading of a will he expected to contest. His smile, when he offered it across the room, was stretched tight, a cheap synthetic imitation of genuine affection. Richard was the primary complication in my life, and historically, he had been the primary complication in Dad's ledger. "If we could turn our attention to the matter at hand," Mr. Henderson intoned, his voice dry and rustling like old legal parchment. He slid a pair of half-moon glasses down his nose and opened the thick, cream-colored manila envelope. I leaned back, ready for the preamble,
the legal jargon establishing the date of the last legitimate will, the standard definitions of assets, the emotional but necessary confirmation of my status as the executor. I knew the drill. Dad and I had reviewed his estate plan meticulously just last fall, a tedious 6-hour session where we cataloged everything from the rare Peruvian stamps to the precise coordinates of the offshore accounts. The details were ironclad, notarized, and backed up by enough digital redundancy to survive an EMP strike. But the preamble never came. Henderson skipped straight to the shocking reveal, the theatrical moment designed to maximize tension, though I suspect he truly disliked the document he was about to read. His face was a mask of professional discomfort, his lips pressed into a thin, apologetic line.
"This document," Henderson began, tapping the crisp paper, "is dated 3 weeks prior to Mr. Beaumont's unfortunate passing. It supersedes all previous iterations, including the one drafted in September of last year." A collective intake of breath could be heard from the various assembled cousins who had been hoping for a share of the silver tea set. I frowned. 3 weeks ago? Dad had been confined to the house, frail and battling a persistent infection that had weakened him significantly. He hadn't left the property, hadn't had any major life events, and certainly hadn't mentioned making any wholesale changes to a plan that had taken decades to perfect. "In this final testament," Henderson continued, avoiding my gaze completely and speaking directly to the far wall, "Mr. Arthur Beaumont explicitly revokes the previous appointment of Alexis Beaumont as executor of the estate."
The room went silent, save for the faint, desperate wheezing of Aunt Linda trying to hold back a celebratory choke. I didn't move. My confusion was a cold, dense block in my chest, rapidly crystallizing into full-blown dread. "Excuse me, Mr. Henderson," I interjected, keeping my voice low and level, a deliberate contrast to the rising hysteria of the situation. "Who has been appointed executor?" Richard leaned forward slightly, a barely perceptible smirk playing on his lips. He already knew the answer. "The document appoints Richard Beaumont as the sole executor of the estate," Henderson recited, ticking the line off with a manicured finger. "Furthermore, the bulk of the liquid assets, approximately $11 million, along with the deeds to the waterfront condo and the primary investment properties, are to be placed in a specifically dedicated trust managed solely by Mr. Richard Beaumont." This was absurd. This wasn't just improbable. It was a deliberate, malicious fiction. Dad had considered Richard a financial liability, a black hole of reckless spending and entrepreneurial failures. The last time Dad had lent Richard a significant sum, $500,000, for a dubious venture involving high-end customizable dog leashes, it had ended in bankruptcy and a very strained Thanksgiving dinner. To hand Richard the keys to the entire empire was akin to giving a toddler a flamethrower and placing them in charge of the fuel depot. The new will went on to assign me, the diligent child, the one who had actually cared for him during his final months, a surprisingly specific and humiliating inheritance. The family home, a beautiful but maintenance-heavy piece of property worth perhaps $4 million, but with the caveat that I would receive absolutely none of the liquid funds necessary to maintain it, pay the significant property taxes, or handle the looming capital gains. The rest of the sprawling collection of assets was distributed in meaningless scraps, some art to Linda, a small endowment to a questionable charity Richard championed, and a few $1,000s to a housekeeper who had retired 10 years ago. When Henderson finally closed the file, the silence was shattered by Linda's genuine, unrestrained sniffle of relief. Richard, meanwhile, simply crossed his arms, settling back into the velvet upholstery with the comfortable air of a man who had successfully concluded a highly favorable negotiation. "This document," I said, standing up, my knees feeling oddly rubbery beneath me. I walked around the end of the mahogany table,
peering down at the crisp new paper. "This is a lie." Henderson flinched, instinctively pulling the document away from my grasp. "Mr. Beaumont, I assure you, it appears to be executed correctly. It bears your father's signature and has been witnessed by 2 impartial parties." "Impartial?"
I scoffed, the cynicism boiling over. "Richard, who are the witnesses?" Richard shrugged, still smiling, still entirely too relaxed. "Just a couple of good friends. You wouldn't know them. They helped Dad out in the final weeks." "And where precisely was this document signed?" I demanded. "In the house, of course," Richard replied easily. "Dad was feeling a bit better that day. He wanted to make sure everything was sorted, neat and tidy, you know? He specifically asked us to finalize it in the kitchen, actually. Nice natural light for signing, he said. The kitchen. The biggest, most technologically advanced room in the entire house. The casualness of the location, the complete disregard for the formality Dad always demanded for legal proceedings, was the final stinging proof that something was profoundly wrong.
My father, Arthur Beaumont, had signed his previous legitimate will, a document half the length, in the sterile, air-conditioned sanctity of Henderson's boardroom, surrounded by 3 lawyers and a certified notary, requiring 2 forms of government identification. My father, Arthur Beaumont, had signed his previous legitimate will, a document half the length, in the sterile, air-conditioned sanctity of Henderson's boardroom, surrounded by 3 lawyers and a certified notary, requiring 2 forms of government identification and a blood oath, probably. He treated a slight change to his investment portfolio with more gravity than Richard was applying to the wholesale distribution of a $15 million estate. The idea that Dad, in his weakened state, suddenly decided to drastically restructure his entire legacy, cutting out the only child who hadn't bankrupted him, on a whim, in the informal setting of the kitchen, with 2 of Richard's good friends acting as impartial witnesses, was laughable.
He couldn't tell the difference between the nurse and the television remote. The man couldn't manage to swallow soup without assistance, let alone sign a complex legal document fundamentally altering his estate planning. Richard's smile hardened, losing its synthetic charm. He had a good day, Alex, a moment of clarity. He wanted to ensure my future was secure. He knew I had potential. Potential. Richard had the potential to empty a vault faster than a team of professional thieves. "This is fraud," I stated, flatly, with no emotion left in the declaration. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Beaumont," Henderson warned, his voice rising slightly in alarm. "It's the truth," I countered, turning my back on Richard's self-satisfied face. The others in the room, Aunt Linda and the peripheral cousins, were now exchanging nervous glances, sensing the expensive legal storm about to break. They had secured their small, pathetic inheritances, and now they just wanted to escape before they were subpoenaed. "I will be contesting this, Mr. Henderson," I declared. "I want copies of everything. The signature analysis, the witness affidavits, the entire chain of custody for this document. I want to know who those witnesses are, where they work, and what Richard promised them for their trouble." Richard let out a soft, theatrical sigh, rubbing his temples as if I were the one causing him undue stress. "Oh, Alex, must you always be so dramatic? Dad gave me his blessing. He loved me, and he knew I could handle the money. Don't drag this through the courts. It's messy, and frankly, Dad wouldn't have wanted the drama." I paused at the doorway, my hand resting on the smooth brass knob. I turned back to face them, letting my gaze sweep over the entire room, finally landing on Richard. The dark humor surfaced then, the cynical realization of the depth of his delusion.
"Dad's last expressed wish, Richard, was for you to finally pay back the $80,000 you borrowed for that ridiculous bespoke juice cleanse startup, I reminded him, my voice carrying the weight of years of accumulated disappointment. And as for drama, you forged a $15 million document and used my dying father's signature to commit the theft. You started the drama, Richard. I'm just going to finish it, and I promise you, I will make sure it is far messier and far more public than you can possibly imagine. I stepped out of the dining room, the scent of lilies and deceit trailing after me. The house felt huge and hollow, but as I walked toward the front door, my attention snagged on the open-plan kitchen Richard had so confidently named as the Forgery site. It was a beautiful space, all stainless steel, imported marble, and state-of-the-art appliances. It was also, thanks to Dad's obsession with tech convergence, a literal smart kitchen.
Everything was integrated. The Sub-Zero refrigerator tracked inventory, the high-end Miele oven connected to the Wi-Fi, and the ceiling, above the very spot where Richard claimed the signing occurred, held 3 unobtrusive tiny black domes that Dad had installed just last year. They weren't just smoke detectors or motion sensors. They were high-definition, voice-activated monitoring systems. Dad loved his gadgets. He loved his privacy, but he loved his gadgets more. He had installed an entire ecosystem of what he called home efficiency monitors, a network of devices running off the central smart hub that logged everything from the temperature fluctuations to who requested the lights be dimmed. The primary system running the whole technological circus was called EchoMax, a proprietary system Dad had insisted on having built into the ceilings of all the common areas. He had justified the expense by claiming it was for climate control optimization.
In reality, it was a colossal, self-recording diary. Richard had forged the will in the kitchen, and the smart home, I realized with a sudden electrifying surge of cold clarity, had almost certainly recorded every single word. Every negotiation, every coerced signature, every smug, self-congratulatory comment Richard had made during the execution of his grand, idiotic crime. I pulled out my phone, accessing the old security contractor's number. This wasn't just a legal battle now, it was a forensic audit of an extremely ambitious digital footprint. Richard had forgotten that in the modern world, the walls don't just have ears, they have gigabytes of storage capacity, cloud backups, and excellent high-fidelity microphones. He had been so focused on securing the paper trail that he had completely ignored the digital ecosystem that encompassed us all, silently running in the background, witnessing everything. This fight was far from over.
In fact, it was just about to get beautifully technical and horrifyingly incriminating for my half-brother. I knew then that the only way to truly honor my father was not through quiet grief, but through the loud, humiliating destruction of the man who had tried to steal his legacy. The kitchen, Richard's crime scene, would be his undoing. I stood there in the living room, the Persian rug feeling suddenly thin beneath my shoes, watching the performance unfold. If there is one certainty in life, besides death and taxes, it is that grief serves as the perfect spotlight for showcasing the absolute worst traits of the living. Dad had only been gone for 72 hours, barely enough time for the scent of disinfectant and decay to dissipate from the hospice room, yet the house already felt less like a monument to his memory and more like an auction house waiting for the gavel. The heirs, that was the term, Mr.
Thompson,
Dad's ancient, perpetually confused lawyer had used with such clinical detachment. The heirs. It sounded less like family and more like a collective of vultures gathered around a carcass. Chief among them, and certainly the most theatrically inclined, was my half-sister, Claire. Claire, who had meticulously avoided Dad for the better part of the last decade, suddenly transformed into the bereaved daughter of the century. She wore black, naturally, but it wasn't the mourning black of solemn respect. It was the expensive, tailored black of someone dressing for a high-stakes meeting. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief that I knew for a fact cost more than my monthly car payment, all while simultaneously coordinating catering via whispered texts to her husband, Stephen. Ah, Stephen. Stephen was the epitome of inherited wealth ambition, a man whose entire personality seemed molded around the singular goal of maximizing quarterly returns.
He wasn't technically an heir, but he was Claire's shadow, her financial consigliere, and the architect of her every strategic manipulation. He stood near the mahogany liquor cabinet, ostensibly comforting Claire, but really he was cataloging the Baccarat crystal collection. I watched him briefly tap the glass of the cabinet, a soft, calculating motion. That was Stephen's language: cost, value, liquidation. He didn't mourn Dad. He mourned the fact that Dad hadn't died sooner, thereby delaying their access to the real estate portfolio. The sheer absurdity of the situation almost made me laugh, a hysterical, ugly sound that I thankfully kept trapped in my throat. Aunt Linda, Dad's sister, was currently occupying the center stage, oscillating between genuine, tear-filled sobs, triggered, I suspected, by the memory of her own financial woes, and aggressive networking.
She cried louder than anyone, which, considering Dad hadn't spoken to her since she tried to borrow $200,000 to invest in a doomed avocado toast franchise, was an Olympic feat of hypocrisy. But the true masterpiece of the macabre theater was her constant refrain: he always wanted to see us happy. Which, in Linda speak, translated roughly to, I deserve the beach house outright, and I'm willing to fight a civil war over the patio furniture if necessary. I, the dutiful daughter who had moved back across the country, put my own career on pause and spent the final grueling 19 months managing Dad's chemotherapy appointments, physical therapy, and increasingly complex medical needs, was relegated to the periphery. I was the quiet observer, the one still genuinely reeling from the raw physical shock of loss, trying to find a corner of the house that didn't feel contaminated by their collective hunger. Then came the meeting, the reading of the documents that would inevitably define the next decade of family relationships, or, more accurately, sever them permanently. We gathered around the large oval dining table, a heavy piece of furniture that had seen decades of Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. Now it felt like a judicial bench. Mr. Thompson, smelling faintly of mothballs and panic, cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses low on his nose. Before we proceed, he began, his voice thin and reedy, I must confirm that, upon Mr. Peterson's explicit instruction, a new last will and testament was executed just 3 weeks ago, superseding all previous documents. It was properly witnessed and notarized. A chill went down my spine, a cold, immediate dread that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. 3 weeks. 3 weeks ago, Dad was lucid, but severely weakened, and heavily medicated.
3 weeks ago, Claire and Stephen had made a rare, inexplicable visit, flying in suddenly, citing concern for Dad's declining health. Their visit had lasted exactly 48 hours, during which they spent an inordinate amount of time sequestered in the large, open-plan kitchen, which Dad found comfortable because of its radiant floor heating. I had dismissed the visit then as merely odd,
Now the hair stood up on my back. Mr. Thompson read the terms, the usual pleasantries, small bequests to a few charities, Dad's watch to my cousin Alex, were dispatched quickly. Then came the bombshell. Regarding the primary estate, including the equity in the Pacific Heights residence, the entire investment portfolio valued at $7.3 million, and the Lake Tahoe vacation property, Thompson paused, adjusting his tie. The testator, Mr.
Arthur Peterson, directs that these assets be placed entirely in the hands of his daughter, Claire Peterson, and her husband, Stephen Thompson, to be administered as they see fit. Silence. A horrifying, pregnant silence that felt louder than a gunshot. Stephen, the man who steals $2 million but won't pay for Spotify Premium, allowed a minuscule, almost imperceptible smirk to touch his lips. Claire gasped dramatically, the performance instantly kicking into high gear. She shot me a look of practiced sympathy, a look that said, "Oh, darling, I'm so sorry this had to happen, but aren't I just the most responsible choice?" My heart didn't just sink. It dropped straight into my stomach and dissolved. It wasn't the money, not entirely. It was the blatant, impossible betrayal. Dad would never do this. Never. I had sacrificed everything. I had missed job opportunities and life events. I had slept on a pull-out couch for almost 2 years to be near him, helping him manage his pain and fear.
And now, 3 weeks before his death, he had allegedly signed over the entirety of his liquid and fixed assets to the daughter who sent him a Christmas card every 4 years, and the son-in-law who asked him about his dividend strategy every time they spoke. "Wait," I finally managed to say, my voice sounding strained and foreign. "What about the previous will, the one from 2018, the one where everything was divided equally, accounting for my time as caregiver?" Mr. Thompson looked profoundly uncomfortable. "That document, Miss Peterson, is invalid. Mr. Peterson 3 weeks ago indicated a desire to simplify the estate planning process. He stated that Claire and Stephen were in a better financial position to manage the diverse assets." I almost laughed. Simplify? This was Dad. Dad categorized his spice rack alphabetically. He used 3 different accountants just to manage his retirement funds. The man thrived on complexity. And Claire and Stephen, who had filed for bankruptcy 2 years prior after an ill-advised venture into artisanal dog biscuits, were suddenly the paragons of financial responsibility? It was ludicrous. It was insulting. It was, definitively, a lie. I looked at Claire. Her eyes were still brimming with those phony tears, but her posture had hardened, subtly transitioning from grieving daughter to wealthy landowner. Stephen was already making mental notes about the best offshore tax havens. "Where was this signed?" I pressed, ignoring the look of desperate entreaty from Thompson. Claire chimed in smoothly, her voice sweet and concerned. "Darling, why are you being so difficult? Dad did it right here. Stephen and I flew in, remember? We were talking to him about his legacy, and he just felt so much clarity. He wanted everything settled." "In the house?" I asked, my gaze fixed on her. "Which room?" She hesitated, just a fraction too long.
A flicker of panic crossed Stephen's face before he recovered, smoothing his expensive silk tie. "The kitchen," Stephen interjected, his tone authoritative and dismissive. "It was late. He was tired. We did the signing right there at the island. Mr. Peterson was quite specific about the comfort level." The kitchen island, the massive granite countertop, the heart of the home, equipped with the latest smart appliances, and crucially, the location of the new Nest Hub Max display that Dad had insisted on installing for easy video calls with me when I was still living far away. "I see," I murmured, the pieces beginning to click into place, dark and sharp. The idea that Dad,
a stickler for legal formalities, who insisted on signing even bank deposit slips with a fountain pen at a proper desk, would execute a multi-million-dollar estate transfer casually on a granite kitchen island, felt offensively wrong. It screamed expediency. It screamed coercion. It screamed forgery.
But who was I to accuse them? The bitter, overlooked sister lashing out in grief. I knew that was exactly how they would frame it should I challenge the will in probate court. I would be the emotionally distraught, financially dependent sibling fighting against the responsible, charitable heirs. The optics were terrible. Yet my intuition, honed by 2 years of navigating Dad's moods, medications, and doctors, was screaming a truth so loud it drowned out the muffled sobs of Aunt Linda. They didn't just pressure him. They didn't just trick him into signing something vague. They fabricated it. They had flown in, seen his failing health as an opportunity, and somehow managed to procure a signature on a document he either hadn't read or hadn't been coherent enough to understand. I left the dining room before Thompson finished his tedious explanations about administrative fees, muttering some vague excuse about needing air. I walked slowly toward the kitchen.
It was empty now, smelling faintly of the expensive flowers Claire had ordered and the residual coffee grounds. The kitchen. It had been Dad's safe space, a room filled with light and the gentle hum of modern technology designed to make life easier. And that technology, I realized, was now the only witness I had. Dad had been a massive enthusiast of smart home technology, specifically for security and convenience. He wasn't tracking us, but he loved the interconnectedness. The Nest system wasn't just thermostats and locks. It included motion sensors, the aforementioned Hub Max, which had a robust internal microphone and camera, always off unless activated for a video call, or so we thought. And the refrigerator. Yes, the refrigerator. Dad had bought a ridiculous smart refrigerator with a massive external touchscreen, complete with internal cameras, so he could check the contents of the milk carton while he was at the grocery store.
The true comedy, the moment that epitomized the pure, pathetic cheapness of Stephen and Claire, was that they hadn't considered the operational footprint of their crime. They had been so focused on the legal document, the notary, and the signature, that they completely ignored the 21st century elephant in the room: surveillance capitalism. Claire and Stephen, who viewed security cameras as something only necessary for guarding their own property, probably assumed Dad's gadgets were just useless toys for an old man. They likely assumed that the sheer volume of data generated by the devices was too overwhelming, too ephemeral to ever be retrieved or weaponized. That was their critical flaw: arrogance fueled by greed. They believed that because they were in Dad's private kitchen, forging the will felt safe, intimate, and untraceable.
But Dad's kitchen, thanks to his obsession with connectivity, was a digital archive, silently recording temperature fluctuations, light changes, opening drawers, and, most importantly, sound. The ambient noise profile was vast: the clatter of a spoon, the whir of the fancy automatic can opener, even the specific frequency of Stephen's deeply annoying habit of clearing his throat when he was nervous. I stood before the kitchen island, running my fingers over the smooth, cold granite where they had supposedly committed their $1,000,000 fraud. I pictured them here, perhaps whispering, perhaps arguing, perhaps holding Dad's frail hand to guide the pen. The audacity of it was staggering. They had taken my grief, packaged it, and tied a neat bow of legal paperwork around it. But I wasn't just grieving, I was angry, and I was, thanks to Dad's lifelong insistence on technological literacy, dangerously informed.
I knew exactly where the server was stored, tucked away in the dusty office closet. I knew the passwords, the backup protocols, and the company Dad used for his cloud storage. The immediate challenge wasn't proving they had forged the document. Any decent lawyer could poke holes in the timing and Dad's competency. The challenge was stopping them from liquidating the assets immediately, a move Stephen was no doubt already planning, and securing incontrovertible evidence of their conspiracy. My first mission was to find the recording of the 3 weeks prior. I needed to isolate the 48 hours they had spent in this house. I needed the sound files, the metadata, the logs. I needed the moment they forged the will in the kitchen, captured by the devices they were too stupid or too cheap to bother turning off. They had seen Dad's wealth, but they had utterly failed to see the digital breadcrumbs he had left behind. And those crumbs, I realized, were my only hope.
I took a deep breath, the scent of expensive flowers still cloying in the air. The performance was over. Now the investigation had to begin. I didn't know how I was going to spin this legally, or how I would navigate the treacherous waters of the probate court against Stephen's high-priced, shark-toothed legal team. But I knew one thing. I wasn't leaving this kitchen until I knew exactly what Dad's digital witnesses had captured. The game was on, and Claire and Stephen had just drastically underestimated the resolve of the disinherited daughter and the meticulousness of the dead man's beloved technology. The irony that they had stolen millions but were about to be undone by a cheap microphone buried in a smart speaker was almost too delicious, too satisfyingly pathetic to bear. The first reading of the will wasn't held in a somber lawyer's office filled with leather and the quiet scent of dusty jurisprudence.
No, Richard insisted it be held at Dad's house, the house Richard fully intended to occupy by the end of the month, for comfort and continuity. It was an absurd theater performance staged in the living room, overlooked by a portrait of Dad that seemed to be actively frowning down upon the proceedings. Mr. Henderson, Dad's estate lawyer of 30 years, looked deeply uncomfortable. He kept adjusting his tie, glancing nervously at Richard, who sat on the antique velvet sofa with the self-satisfied smirk of a cat who had just swallowed a canary and was now considering the porcelain figurine on the mantelpiece. Aunt Linda, true to form, was in full tragic regalia. She wore black that looked suspiciously new and expensive and dabbed at her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She had perfected the art of the performative sob, a sharp intake of breath followed by a silent, dramatic slump, all while subtly ensuring her view of the lawyer was unimpeded. I sat across the room, feeling like a ghost in my own memories, watching them devour the remnants of my father's life before the earth had even fully settled over his casket. The air was thick with hypocrisy and the faint scent of Linda's expensive grief perfume. When Mr. Henderson finally cleared his throat, a rasping sound that signaled the beginning of the end of my life as I knew it, Richard leaned forward, elbows on his knees, ready for the victory lap he felt he deserved. Henderson began with the usual boilerplate language, the clauses about executorship and debt settlement, and then he arrived at the critical part, the part where my name, the sole heir, should have appeared, followed by the specific instruction to distribute the $3.2 million estate, the primary residence, and the entire stock portfolio to me. But that's not what happened. Instead, Henderson began reading a document dated 3 weeks prior to Dad's sudden fatal heart attack. A document none of us had ever heard of. A document ostensibly signed in the kitchen, witnessed by 2 people named Brenda and Gary, whom Richard later vaguely referred to as some people I know from the yacht club. The tone was completely wrong, clinically direct, lacking Dad's usual wry flourishes, or the specific sentimental bequests he always joked about, the naming of his prize-winning rhododendrons, for instance. The fraudulent will stated, in agonizing detail,
that Dad had experienced a sudden, profound change of heart regarding the distribution of his assets. Instead of everything going to me, his only surviving child, the estate was to be cleaved like a rotting log.
60%, including the house and the entirety of the liquid assets, the brokerage account and the fixed deposits, was directed to my dear, struggling Uncle Richard, ostensibly to compensate him for past uncompensated business advice. I nearly choked on the implication that Richard, a man whose main business accomplishment was repeatedly bankrupting small niche marketing firms, had provided sound advice to a retired CFO who had managed a corporate budget larger than some small nations. The remaining 40%.
The final, bizarre kicker was that I, the designated primary beneficiary of all previous legitimate wills, was left one single specific item, the antique brass compass Dad had used on his first sailing trip decades ago. An item I immediately realized that Richard didn't even recognize the monetary value of, dismissing it as junk shop nautical paraphernalia. It was the ultimate insult, a calculated reduction of my entire life's inheritance to a sentimental trinket. A sharp, hysterical laugh almost escaped me, but I managed to suppress it, swallowing the acidic bile of betrayal. Richard, mistaking my stunned silence for acceptance, actually beamed. He clapped his hands together once, a loud, vulgar sound in the quiet room. "Well," he declared, adjusting his expensive Italian tie, which still smelled of the plastic wrap it had been pulled from moments before. "That settles it then. A smooth transition, exactly what my brother would have wanted."
Linda immediately began her encore performance, weeping dramatically into the antique sofa cushion. "Oh, poor George," she wailed, her voice muffled enough to sound heartbroken, but clear enough to ensure everyone heard her. "He suffered so much, but thank heavens he managed to put his affairs in order for the family's stability." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the layers of absurdity pile up. Linda, who hadn't spoken to Dad for 6 months after he refused to bail her out of a disastrous multi-level marketing scheme involving artisan soap, was now deeply concerned with his stability. That's the funeral paradox right there. The moment the deceased stops being a person and starts being a monetary resource, the level of perceived sorrow becomes directly proportional to the potential payout. Linda was crying about the Mustang's estimated resale value, not Dad.
"Uncompensated business advice," I finally said, my voice dangerously calm, cutting through Linda's muffled sobs. "Richard, the last time Dad took your advice, he ended up owning 6,000 shares in a company that manufactured novelty toothbrushes, which promptly filed Chapter 11. He lost $50,000 on that little venture." Richard chuckled, a dry, grating sound. "A minor setback. Think of the long game, darling. This new arrangement shows he realized the importance of familial loyalty when it truly mattered. He obviously felt a deep need to secure my financial future." The self-serving arrogance was breathtaking. Richard was a bottomless pit of entitlement wrapped in tailored clothes. He had always lived his life with the firm belief that someone else, usually Dad, should foot the bill for his expensive failures and even more expensive tastes.
He was the kind of person who would refuse to pay the extra dollar for guacamole, but expect a 5-star hotel room to appear magically free of charge. He was cheap where it didn't matter, and rapacious where it did. Stealing the bulk of his dead brother's estate wasn't an ethical dilemma for him. It was a clever logistical maneuver, a final successful negotiation. I noticed Mr. Henderson kept rubbing his temples. He was a professional, but even his stone-faced demeanor was cracking under the weight of this palpable, sickening farce. "Mr. Henderson," I asked, deliberately ignoring Richard's preening. "This will states it was drafted and signed on October 14th at 9 p.m. Is that correct?" Henderson nodded, relieved, I think, that someone was engaging with the facts instead of the melodrama. "That is the date notarized, yes, and the signatures of the witnesses, Brenda and Gary." "And where was this signing conducted?" Richard jumped in before Henderson could answer.
"In the kitchen, naturally. It was a casual affair. George was making his midnight tea, a moment of deep reflection, clearly. The kitchen, the very heart of the house, the nerve center where Dad had installed his ridiculously robust smart home system, complete with the ubiquitous voice assistant and its high-definition sound sensors that captured every stray cough, every muttered recipe instruction, and every whispered complaint about the temperature. "Right," I said, leaning back, letting the implication hang in the air for just a second. "The kitchen. And those witnesses, Brenda and Gary, they are entirely unknown to me, and, I suspect, entirely unknown to my father prior to this very specific night." "They are respectable people," Richard insisted, his tone hardening slightly. The easy confidence was beginning to fray at the edges. "Acquaintances of mine, simply assisting a friend with a critical, private, legal matter."
A legal matter that reverses 30 years of meticulous estate planning and hands the entirety of the assets to the person whose credit score required Dad to co-sign on his last 3 vehicles? I allowed myself a genuine, cold smile. "Richard, you didn't provide business advice. You provided coercion, or worse. This entire document is transparently fraudulent." Aunt Linda stopped crying immediately. Her head snapped up, the mascara slightly smudged now, revealing the stark fury beneath the veneer of grief. "How dare you accuse your uncle of such a thing? He is family. We are merely following George's last clearly stated wishes." "Last wishes forged poorly enough to require witnesses? I'm betting you paid $50 in cash to sign on a coffee-stained page." The cynicism had fully taken over now. It was liberating, an adrenaline rush of justifiable rage mixed with the dark humor of knowing exactly how low these people would sink. Richard finally lost his temper. His face flushed a patchy red. He stood up, towering over the seated Henderson. "That's slander. We have a signed, notarized legal document. You have nothing but baseless accusations driven by spite and jealousy." "Spite? Jealousy?" I repeated, almost amused. "Richard, I watched my father work 50 hours a week for 40 years to build that estate. You watched him from the golf course, always ready to borrow 20 grand and never pay it back. My spite is earned. My jealousy is simply the realization that the man I trusted most, the man who was supposed to be my father's brother, is nothing more than a cheap, opportunistic thief." This was the pivot point, the moment the reading of the will transitioned from a formality into a declaration of war. Richard sputtered, trying to find a sufficiently devastating retort, but his vocabulary was severely limited when he wasn't discussing yacht repairs or vintage scotch. He kept gesturing wildly at the document Henderson held, relying entirely on the physical paper to confirm his legitimacy. I knew the battle ahead would be ugly, expensive, and emotionally draining. Fighting family in court over a death is a miserable, demeaning business. It reduces human relationships to spreadsheets and legal briefs. But sitting there, staring at Richard's cheap loafers, worn without socks as always, even to a funeral and a will reading, and Linda's feigned misery, I realized it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about principle. It was about honoring Dad's actual memory and refusing to let these vultures perform the final, grotesque act of stealing his legacy. "You should know, Richard," I said softly, standing up to meet his height. "I am going to fight this. I will spend every last dime I have left to expose this pathetic little scam." He sneered. "And on what grounds exactly?"
The document is clean. Where's your proof, little heiress?
The proof, I whispered, glancing pointedly at the entrance to the kitchen, is already in the house. You just didn't realize the witnesses were digital. This statement hung in the air like poison gas. Richard's face paled beneath his tan. Linda stopped dabbing at her face and stared, suddenly rigid. They were so focused on the analog deception, the paper, the signatures, the cheap notary stamp, that they had completely forgotten the digital environment of the crime scene. They had forged the will in the kitchen, and they had been arrogant enough to assume that the same technology Dad used to set ambient lighting and monitor his coffee pot was not also listening to their every syllable. They had forgotten about the permanent record. They had forgotten about the cloud backup. The moment I mentioned the digital witnesses, the mask of smug assurance dropped completely, replaced by pure, ugly panic.
Richard's eyes darted frantically towards the kitchen door, calculating the distance between his chair and the hardware that was about to condemn him. The war had officially begun, and I had just fired the first digitally recorded shot. The Kitchen Counter Affidavit. The funeral itself was a masterpiece of emotional forgery, a grand performance mounted by the very people who had, perhaps just days before, been negotiating the final terms of their future inheritance over a stale Danish pastry. I watched them all, these vultures in expensive black silk, circling the remains of a man who had loved them despite their constant, exhausting neediness. Aunt Linda, my father's sister, who had not spoken to him in 8 years over a dispute involving a timeshare in Boca Raton, suddenly appeared, weeping dramatically into a handkerchief that looked suspiciously new and unwrinkled.
Her grief, I noted with detached cynicism, was the loudest in the room, which was an impressive feat, considering she was already texting her realtor about Dad's beach house inventory before the casket was even lowered onto the mechanism. It was during the reading of the supposed final testament that the theatrical masks began to slip, revealing the true, calculating eyes beneath. We gathered in the oak-paneled office of Mr. Stern, Dad's estate lawyer, a man whose face was etched with so much weary defeat that he looked less like a legal professional and more like someone who had just lost a very large, poorly supervised bet on a minor league soccer game. Mr. Stern cleared his throat repeatedly, avoiding eye contact with me. This, I knew, was the international legal signal for something awful has happened, and I wish I were currently working as a shepherd in remote Mongolia.
The atmosphere shifted instantly when he began to read the document dated just 2 days prior to Dad's sudden, unexpected hospitalization. Before that date, I was the sole beneficiary, not because I was the favorite, but because I was the only person who hadn't asked him for a substantial loan since 2010. The original will, meticulously drafted and stored in a vault for decades, ensured the business assets, the vintage car collection, and the majority of the liquid investments came directly to me, ensuring the continuity of the small empire Dad had built. The new document, this crude, pathetic piece of paper that smelled faintly of cheap copier toner and denial, changed everything. It wasn't a tweak. It was a total overhaul, a financial decapitation.
The bulk of the estate was now split, 60% to my stepmother, Susan, and 40% divided equally between her 2 adult children, Richard and Candace, whom Dad had reluctantly funded through various failed entrepreneurial ventures and multiple expensive divorces. My inheritance was reduced to a few sentimental items, a collection of rare stamps Dad knew I had absolutely no interest in, and, insultingly, a single slightly damaged Chippendale chair that he once tripped over and swore he would burn in the backyard. The numbers were specific, which made the betrayal feel surgically precise. The family trust, valued at $17 million, was entirely redirected. My father's prized 1963 Aston Martin, which he had promised me when I was 6 and which I had helped him restore in our youth, was now designated for Richard, Susan's son, a man who, I must stress, struggled to operate a simple electric can opener and viewed manual transmission as a personal affront.
Richard, the ultimate post-child for low-effort entitlement, leaned forward in his leather chair, a smirk twitching at the corner of his mouth as Mr. Stern droned through the technical clauses. Richard was the kind of person who defined cheapness not as frugality, but as a moral failing. He had stolen $2 million worth of company assets over the years, before Dad mercifully cut him off, yet still refused to pay the $9.99 subscription fee for Spotify Premium, forcing the entire office to listen to ad breaks that constantly screamed about debt consolidation. Seeing him suddenly inherit a vehicle worth $750,000 was, quite simply, an insult to both capitalism and good taste. "Are there any questions?" Mr. Stern asked, his voice cracking like dry autumn leaves. Candace, Richard's sister, whose defining characteristic was her ability to maintain a perfectly manicured nail despite never performing a useful task, spoke up first.
"Just one," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "I know this is terribly difficult for him," she said, nodding vaguely in my direction, as if I were a distant, confused relative who needed supervision. "But the distribution of the beach house furniture is that immediate." I looked at Candace, whose entire life philosophy could be summed up by her relentless pursuit of designer logo visibility. She genuinely seemed more concerned about the throw pillows in a secondary residence than the fact that her mother and brother had just systematically looted the estate of the man who had paid for her college tuition, her wedding, and her subsequent divorce lawyer. This level of self-absorption wasn't just pathetic, it was almost artistic in its audacity. "The distribution schedule is outlined in Appendix C, subsection 4, Mr. Stern replied, looking miserable. I finally found my voice, a steady, low rumble of contained fury.
"This document is fraudulent," I stated simply. The room fell silent, save for the faint, high-pitched scratching sound as Susan fiddled nervously with the expensive diamond bracelet Dad had bought her last Christmas. Susan, my stepmother, who had perfected the look of passive martyrdom, finally spoke, deploying her signature blend of hurt feelings and thinly veiled aggression. "Fraudulent?" she repeated, her eyes wide with manufactured offense. "Darling, your father specifically updated his wishes. He wanted to ensure that Richard and Candace were finally secure. He was worried about them. What she meant, of course, was that she had cornered Dad during a moment of post-medication confusion and coerced him into signing whatever she placed in front of him. I knew Dad. He was many things, stubborn, slightly over-generous, and prone to impulse-buying antique maps, but he was not capricious.
He simply did not make life-altering financial decisions, especially those concerning the business he built from scratch, based on a sudden, last-minute whim, and certainly not favoring two people whose primary financial strategy was send the bill to Dad. My immediate decision was swift and expensive. I retained the most feared probate attorney in the state, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor didn't charge by the hour, she charged by the amount of misery she inflicted on the opposing counsel, and her retainer alone could have paid for Candace's next 3 European spa vacations. Eleanor, a woman who treated legal briefs like surgical instruments, looked over the alleged final will with the same expression one might reserve for finding a dead mouse in a favorite shoe. "The signatures are sloppy," she observed dryly, pointing to the shaky line that was supposed to be my father's signature. "And the witnesses are a friend of Susan's and Richard's dentist."
Not exactly pillars of neutral oversight. We began the discovery process, which quickly became an exercise in forensic archaeology mixed with mockery. Eleanor demanded everything, all correspondence, all bank records, and critically, detailed logs of all smart devices in the home. This was the key, the quiet revolution I hadn't fully grasped yet. My father, bless his tech-illiterate heart, had installed a complex high-end smart home system across the entire property, mostly because the salesman had promised it would lower his insurance premiums. He could barely operate the universal remote, but every corner of his home, including the expansive, marble-topped kitchen where the supposed signing took place, was under the watchful, silent ear of a networked microphone and camera. We started pulling the metadata.
Richard's legal defense, funded by the assets he hadn't technically received yet, was centered on a single arrogant premise: that I was simply a bitter child trying to overturn the clear wishes of a deceased parent. "They will argue testamentary capacity," Eleanor explained, tapping a pen against her teeth. "They will claim your father was lucid, aware, and freely executed this document. Our job is to prove not only that he didn't sign it, but that the environment in which they claim he signed it facilitated fraud." We submitted interrogatories to Susan and the heirs, a dense, multi-page document demanding detailed answers about their movements in the hours leading up to and after the signing. Their responses were a glorious study in poorly executed mendacity. "Where exactly did the signing take place?" we asked. Susan's affidavit. "In the kitchen, at the central island, where we often conducted family business."
Where Richard often begged for money while making himself a massive, complicated sandwich. Who was present? Richard's affidavit. Mother, father, myself, Candace, and the two witnesses, all of whom engaged in polite, respectful discussion about father's wishes. A tense shouting match where Susan threatened to cut off Candace's credit card if she didn't keep her mouth shut. The dark humor in the situation was that Richard and Candace genuinely believed their vague, self-serving lies were legally impenetrable. They saw themselves as smooth operators, pulling off the perfect heist, blissfully unaware that every single mundane, greedy conversation they had conducted in that kitchen was archived on a server farm in Silicon Valley. I remember Eleanor and I reviewing Richard's recent spending habits, an effort to establish a motive beyond generic greed. His expenditures were unbelievable. He had spent nearly $40,000 in the 2 weeks after the fraudulent will was supposedly signed, primarily on luxury watches, but he had skimped on legal advice, hiring a bargain basement lawyer who charged just $250 an hour. He's banking on getting the estate before the trial truly begins, Eleanor concluded, shaking her head. He's stealing from the future he hasn't even secured yet. That's a special level of financial short-sightedness. His arrogance was my greatest weapon. He never considered the details. He assumed the law was about presentation, not fact. And in their haste, the heirs had overlooked one critical,
silent witness, the technological infrastructure of the very house they were trying to steal. The kitchen wasn't just the site of the forgery. It was the site of the planning, the execution, and the immediate gloating celebration. We were now preparing the motion to compel discovery of the digital evidence.
Susan's lawyer was fighting it, claiming privacy invasion and irrelevant domestic recordings. But Eleanor had anticipated this. She had structured the request specifically around sound logs associated with key entry times for kitchen lighting activation, and the motion was strong. We didn't need video. We needed the timestamps, the voice print data, and the conversational transcripts generated automatically by the highly sensitive voice-activated system Dad had installed to help him occasionally order groceries when he couldn't find his reading glasses. The deeper we dug into the financial specifics, the clearer the plot became. Susan had emptied Dad's safe deposit box a week before he was admitted to the hospital, claiming she needed family heirlooms for safekeeping. The inventory listed 4 specific items, 3 rare coins, and a crucial legal document, the original valid will. They hadn't just created a fake, they had systematically destroyed the original evidence.
They are not just crooks, they are profoundly incompetent crooks, Eleanor remarked one afternoon, leaning back in her chair. They did the hard part, convincing a sick man to sign something, but they failed at the easy part, covering their tracks in the digital age. They confused being manipulative with being smart. That, my friend, is where the case falls apart. I spent hours listening to snippets of conversations Eleanor's team had been able to retrieve from Dad's general computer logs. Nothing explicit yet, just background noise and voice commands. But even these small sounds told a story of increasing tension and desperation in the house. The sound of a heavy sigh, followed by the clinking of ice cubes, followed by Susan's sharp whispered command, "Alexa, turn off the kitchen microphone." That last command, recorded in the log, was the most telling slip-up of all. They knew the device was listening.
And they hadn't realized that while they could turn off the active recording mode, the smart home system was designed to keep a detailed, indexed log of every single command, including those that were meant to enforce silence. The system was designed to protect the integrity of the home's data, and it had inadvertently created a chain of custody for their conspiracy. We were just days away from presenting the court with not just a paper trail, but an audio diary of betrayal, sealed and indexed by the very voice assistant they had tried to silence. But first, we had to get past their final desperate legal maneuver, the absurd claim that the will was merely a gift and not a testamentary document at all, a claim which I knew with absolute certainty would be obliterated by the voice recordings waiting on that server.
The silence in the courtroom was not the usual respectful hush of legal proceedings. It was a pressurized vacuum, thick with the smell of old paper, expensive cologne, and the faint metallic tang of fear. We had reached the precipice. Months of sleepless nights, 6-figure legal bills, and the agonizing process of listening to Dad's life savings being treated like chips at a poker table were about to culminate in this singular moment. Richard, my dear cousin, the architect of this disastrous and poorly planned scheme, sat at the defense table, his face a mask of practiced self-righteous indignation. He was wearing a tie that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment and kept adjusting it, a nervous tick masquerading as confidence.
Linda, the other half of this unholy alliance, was dabbing her eyes, not with genuine tears, of course, but performing the role of the unjustly persecuted victim, a character she had been rehearsing since we were teenagers, and she blamed me for breaking her favorite porcelain doll, which she had actually tossed into a dumpster because it didn't match her bedroom aesthetic anymore. My lawyer, Miss Davies, a woman whose calm demeanor belied the razor-sharp mind she possessed, stood beside the expert witness, Dr. Alistair Finch. Dr. Finch looked like a kindly university professor who preferred hiking boots to court shoes, which only added to the crushing credibility he was about to unleash. He was the one who had painstakingly extracted and authenticated the digital ghosts of that fateful evening, the ones trapped within the sleek plastic shells of the smart devices that had turned Dad's once cozy kitchen into a surveillance room worthy of a second-rate spy thriller.
The defense attorney, a slick, sweating man named Mr. Peterson, had spent 2 days attempting to discredit Dr. Finch, arguing everything from the possibility of deep fakes to the volatile nature of home Wi-Fi signals. He claimed the data was circumstantial, corrupted, or, in his favorite phrase, the product of technological overreach, infringing upon the sacred privacy of a grieving family. The irony of invoking sacred privacy for a forged document was almost enough to make me laugh out loud, but I held it in, focusing on the dark entertainment of watching Peterson slowly dig his client's financial grave. "Your Honor," Mrs. Davies began, her voice crisp and clear, cutting through the heavy air.
We move now to the central piece of evidence, Exhibit 7 Delta, the raw, unedited audio feed recorded by the proprietary microphone system embedded within the client's kitchen hub, a recording time-stamped and verified by its manufacturer as originating precisely at 11:34 p.m. on October 14th, the date of the alleged signing of the deceased's final will. Richard went pale, the color draining so fast he looked like a plaster bust. Linda stopped dabbing her dry eyes and instead began furiously massaging her temples, a gesture that screamed, "This headache is proof of my innocence." Judge Harrison, a woman who had seen every form of human pettiness imaginable and possessed the weary patience of a saint tasked with running a bureaucracy, nodded slowly. "Proceed, counsel. Let's hear what the appliances had to say."
The room darkened slightly as the projector displayed the technical data, waveforms, metadata logs, GPS coordinates, pinpointing the exact location of the recording device within the geographic bounds of Dad's actual kitchen. Then, the sound began. It wasn't dramatic, not initially. It was the sound of domesticity, which made the subsequent betrayal all the more chilling. The gentle hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of traffic, and then Richard's voice, annoyingly nasal, followed by a sigh that could only belong to Linda. Richard on the recording. "Are you sure this pen works? I don't want smudge marks. This needs to look official." Linda on the recording. "It's a nice pen, Richard. Stop being so cheap. We are doing this for $2.3 million, not for a coupon clipping contest. Just hold the paper steady and turn the blasted air conditioning down. It's freezing in here." My heart pounded a relentless rhythm against my ribs.
It was their voices, unmistakable. But it wasn't the criminal conspiracy itself that was the most damning. It was the sheer mundane stupidity woven into their greed. They were talking about forging a life-altering document, but they were arguing over climate control settings and the quality of office supplies. It perfectly encapsulated the low-grade, transactional evil they represented. They couldn't even commit felony without complaining about minor personal inconveniences. The recording continued, detailing the logistical absurdity of their crime. There was a shuffling sound, the distinct thud of a document hitting the granite countertop. And then the critical moment, the sound of forgery itself. Richard on the recording. "Is this good? Did I get the shake right?
Dad always had that little tremor when he signed official things. Linda, on the recording. Too neat, Richard. Looks like it was signed by a kindergarten teacher. Scribble it up a bit.
Look, nobody is going to question a signature on a document this airtight, but we have to maintain verisimilitude. And stop breathing so heavily. You sound like a serial killer. I'm nervous. This is a felony, Linda. Wait, did we actually remember to cancel the Amazon order for the new kettle? I don't want it showing up tomorrow. Oh, for heaven's sake, Richard, priorities. We just secured a coastal property and enough liquid assets to retire, and you're worried about a $50 appliance? The will is signed. Now, let's shred the drafts and get out of here before the ring camera picks up us doing anything else stupid. The courtroom gasped, a collective, sharp intake of breath. Linda's reference to the ring camera, unaware of the microphone recording her inside the house, was the kind of self-incriminating brilliance that makes legal legends.
Richard had his hands clasped over his mouth, looking less like a slick businessman and more like a 12-year-old caught stealing from the corner store. The judge didn't move, her expression unreadable, but I noticed her hand clenching the pen on her pad. The recording stopped. Ms. Davies let the silence linger, a masterstroke of courtroom drama. As the evidence clearly establishes, Your Honor, Ms. Davies concluded, her voice unwavering, the will presented by the defendants, claiming to be the final testament of the deceased, was not only fabricated, but was quite literally crafted through a conspiracy in the deceased's own kitchen, with the details of their criminal act meticulously preserved by the very smart technology the deceased utilized every single day. The defendants' claims of piety and legitimate inheritance are not just false, they are an insult to the memory of the man they sought to defraud. Mr.
Peterson, who had looked increasingly unwell during the playback, weakly rose to his feet. He mumbled something about potential tampering and the need for further forensic review, but it was hollow. He knew the jig was up. The digital fingerprints were too clean, the voices too clear, and the content too damningly, pathetically honest about their intentions. Judge Harrison placed her pen down with a final, echoing click. She didn't bother calling a recess. She looked directly at Richard and Linda, her eyes carrying the weight of ancient judgment. The court finds the audio evidence to be fully authenticated, material, and decisive, she stated, her voice resonating with authority that made the expensive glass of water on Richard's table visibly tremble. The conversation recorded leaves absolutely no reasonable doubt as to the criminal intent and execution of forgery.
Accordingly, the document filed as the last will and testament, dated October 14th, is hereby declared null and void, having been created under fraudulent pretenses. The estate will proceed according to the prior valid will, dated 5 years ago, placing the sole administration and bulk of the inheritance with the petitioner, the deceased's only child. A small, quiet cheer swelled in my chest, quickly replaced by a profound sense of exhaustion. It wasn't just about the money, though that was certainly significant. It was the final, irreversible vindication of my father's true wishes, and a complete repudiation of their poisonous greed. But the judge wasn't finished. She leaned forward, shedding the neutral judicial persona to deliver the professional roast I had been waiting for.
Furthermore, she continued, her gaze fixed on Richard, the audacity displayed here, utilizing the deceased's recent passing as an opportunity for immediate, clumsy financial theft, demonstrates a spectacular lack of judgment and a fundamental disregard for the rule of law. The court has a duty to uphold justice and deter such blatant criminality. Therefore, I am referring the complete transcript and supporting evidence to the District Attorney's Office for immediate review regarding charges of conspiracy, forgery, and perjury. I imagine the DA will find the evidence,
particularly the defendant's discussion of getting the shake right on a signature, rather compelling. Richard collapsed back into his chair, making a sound somewhere between a cough and a sob. Linda, however, finally found her tears. They were loud, ugly, and entirely self-pitying.
It was a spectacular display of the funeral paradox in reverse. She cried now, not over the loss of her beloved uncle, but over the sudden, violent loss of the $2.3 million she had already mentally spent on a beachfront condo in Cabo. She cried louder than she had at Dad's actual service, which was saying something given her theatrical performance there, involving a fainting spell that necessitated the deployment of 2 paramedics and a suspiciously large handbag. The aftermath was swift and satisfyingly humiliating. As the hearing adjourned, bailiffs moved in to escort Richard and Linda out of the courtroom, not as free citizens, but as defendants facing imminent arrest. Miss Davies handed me a comforting squeeze on the shoulder. "Congratulations," she murmured. "Justice is served, courtesy of smart appliances. Who needs private investigators when you have Alexa listening to every idiotic plot?"
I watched Richard, the man who had the arrogance to steal millions but was too cheap to pay for Spotify Premium, being led away, his expensive tie now looking ridiculously out of place. He caught my eye, and there was a flicker of something terrible, not remorse, but pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't hate me for winning. He hated me for being right, and for having the foresight to hire a lawyer who understood that in the 21st century, every device is a potential witness. The financial recovery was immediate. The estate's assets, frozen during the litigation, were released. Richard and Linda were hit with multiple lawsuits, not just from the state, but civil suits for damages, legal fees, and the cost of the protracted litigation they had forced upon me. The irony was poetic. They had liquidated their own meager savings and retirement accounts to pay Peterson's enormous retainer, only to end up financially ruined before the criminal trial even started.
They had committed a monumental crime, based on the expectation of massive wealth, and the only thing they inherited was crushing debt and a criminal record. I spent the next few weeks sorting through the final administrative details. It was strange. The victory was sweet, but the underlying grief was still there, now unburdened by the legal fight. I went back to Dad's house for the first time since the verdict. I walked into the kitchen, the scene of the crime. The granite countertop was still there, the fancy coffee machine still stood silent, and the small, black kitchen hub sat innocently in the corner, humming softly. I poured myself a cup of coffee. The kitchen was just a kitchen again. It wasn't a crime scene, or a witness stand, or the absurd theater where my greedy relatives had staged their pathetic betrayal. It was simply the heart of the home, a space Dad had loved, now finally quiet.
I realized that the biggest inheritance I received wasn't the house, the investments, or the relieved sense of financial security. It was the absolute, undeniable clarity of knowing who my family truly was and who they were not. I had always tried to believe that deep down, Richard and Linda were decent people, just a bit misguided. The recording shattered that naivety into a million digital pieces. They weren't misguided. They were just cheap, desperate criminals who made one fatal technological mistake, forgetting that the technology designed to make their lives smarter was equally capable of making their crimes stupider. I reached out and gently touched the small smart device. "Thank you," I whispered, a half-joke, half-sincere thank you to the silent guardian that had listened in the dark. It hadn't intended to deliver justice. It had just been programmed to record everything.
And in an age defined by constant data streams, their biggest mistake wasn't forging the will, but assuming that in the quiet of a late night, surrounded by machines,
they were ever truly alone. I had won the battle for the inheritance, but more importantly, I had won the war for Dad's dignity and my own peace of mind. The house was quiet now, the estate settled, and the only remaining hum was the sound of a well-deserved, slightly cynical contentment. My future was secure, built not on the ill-gotten gains of deceit, but on the enduring, utterly accidental integrity of a smart home device. Sometimes, I thought, the absurdity of justice can be the most beautiful thing of all. I drank my coffee, and for the first time in nearly a year, I smiled without reservation. The kitchen was closed for crime. The heirs of greed had received their just, impoverished reward.